I remember the way her skin looked in the dim light of the holding cell, that soft, iridescent glow that usually meant an Aetherian was content, but on her it was flickering like a dying circuit. Elias was sitting just inches away from her on the metal bench. I was standing by the observation glass, and I don't think they even noticed I was there. He reached out, his human hand looking so solid and blunt against her delicate frame, and he touched the crook of her elbow. I saw her shiver. It wasn't fear. It was this raw electric spark that seemed to jump between them, a heat so intense I could almost feel it through the partition. He looked into her eyes, and for a second, the whole diplomatic mess just vanished. But look, we have to go back to how this disaster started. The shimmering spire is the kind of place that looks like a dream, but feels like a tomb. I'd watched Lyra stand there for weeks, presiding over those ridiculous rituals. 42 highborn nobles had come through those doors, offering her moons and trade routes and empires, and she'd looked at every single one of them like they were nothing more than furniture. When she rejected High Commander Valen, the 43rd and most arrogant of the bunch, I knew the Archons had reached their limit. I saw the way her father gripped his staff until his knuckles went white. The decree they issued was cold and final. Choose a mate in 10 days, or the state-mandated pairing system would do it for her. In Etheria, that means losing your soul to an algorithm. Lyra looked composed, but I could see her lower lip trembling just the slightest bit. Haj, truth is, she was trapped, and she knew it. Then the Sol gateway opened, and Elias Thorne walked in. He was a mess, honestly. He smelled of ozone and recycled ship air, and his uniform was creased from the long haul from Earth. He was just an envoy, a man sent to beg for resources his planet desperately needed. I watched him approach the dais, clutching his prepared scripts like a lifeline. He wanted to be respectful, so he tried the high Aetherian greeting. Poor guy. He didn't know that the dialect he'd studied was 3 centuries out of date. When he spoke, the vowels he used didn't say, "Greetings, honored Archons." Because of the way he held his breath, that nervous, hitching rhythm, he accidentally uttered a formal proposal of intent. It was an ancient vow of life bonding. The court went so quiet I could hear the hum of the spire's gravity stabilizers. The Archons were halfway out of their seats to call for his head, but then Lyra stood up. I saw the spark of a wild idea take hold of her. She didn't wait for a translation. She didn't look at her parents. She just looked at Elias, who was standing there looking confused, and she shouted, "Accepted," before anyone could even breathe. I'll never forget the look on his face. It was total, utter shock. But when the guards moved in to seize them both for violating protocol, I saw him step in front of her. He didn't even know her name yet, but he put his body between her and the spears. That was the first time I thought they might actually survive this. Look, the tribunal chamber wasn't just a room. It was a pressurized cage of light and judgment. And I was standing in the dark recesses of the back gallery. Not that anyone was looking at me, watching the Archons peer down from their high seats. Elias looked small. His suit was still wrinkled from the flight, and his face was pale under the harsh, flickering bioluminescence of the ceiling. He was supposed to apologize. The diplomats from Seoul had sent him a whole list of excuses, a way to back out and keep the resource treaty on the table without the marriage complication. I saw the data pad trembling in his hand, but then he didn't even look at the script. I saw him drop it on the floor. It made this hollow plastic clatter that echoed through the whole spire, and the sound seemed to wake everyone up. He just looked at Lyra, who was standing there like a statue of ice, and then he looked at the High Tribunal. And he told them she wasn't a biological asset or a piece of royal property. He talked about her courage, the way she'd risked her entire future on a stranger's linguistic mistake. Truth is, I've never heard a human voice sound so steady while their hands were shaking so hard. I could see the sweat on his brow, catching the glow of the room. Then Lyra spoke, and I don't think I've ever seen her taller. She didn't just defend him. She tore into the optimal match system like it was a prison. She called it a failure of the heart. Her skin was pulsing with this deep, rhythmic violet light, the color of Aetherian rage and love all mixed into one. I remember the way they finally reached for each other's hands right there in the middle of the interrogation. The electric spark was so loud it sounded like a snap of static in the room. Her delicate, glowing fingers laced through his rough human ones, and I saw her exhale for the first time in hours. It was the most defiant thing I've ever seen. The Archons couldn't kill the momentum after that. The public was watching on the feeds, and they were starting to realize that maybe a messy choice was better than a perfect, sterile one. They granted the trial of bonding. It wasn't a total victory yet, but it was the only chance they needed. I saw them again 5 years later. The unification rite had long since passed, a blur of bioluminescent flowers and earthborn music. We were on the palace balcony, and the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the sharp smell of ozone from the departing ships. The combined fleets of Sol and Etheria were rising into the sky, a wall of metal and light that hummed with a vibration I could feel in my own bones. And there they were. Lyra had her head on his shoulder, and he had his arm wrapped tight around her waist. I don't think they've stopped touching since that day in the cell. I saw their daughter, the first of the hybrid heirs, running across the marble. She had Elias's stubborn chin and Lyra's sensory crest that flickered when she laughed. It was strange and beautiful, and completely against every rule we ever had. I don't know. Maybe the universe just needed someone brave enough to make a mistake. I stood there by the door watching them watch the stars. They didn't notice me standing there, but I remember the way the light hit them. The start of an era sparked by a single impulsive word.